All right, everybody, welcome. My name is Scott. This is Richie. We are the tank crewmen from Battlefield Vegas. This year, we've brought to you an Australian Leopard AS1. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical development of the tank. I'm going to hand over to Richie, and he'll tell you what it's like to drive. Before we get to this particular type of Leopard, early Leopard 1 was essentially a complete reset for tank warfare for Germany's tank development. So we're in a place now post World War II. Around 1955, West Germany begins to receive pressure from NATO and Allied forces to begin growing to deal with the rising Soviet threat with the buildup of the Cold War. And West Germany was approved to begin building an armored force again. However, the Germans wanted to essentially design and create their own tank. The Leopard 1 is what they came up with. Germany used all the lessons it learned from World War II to influence the design of this tank. The difference being West Germany now has the influence of the US and their technology to help them. France was also involved in the early stages of the development of the Leopard, but shortly after development began, France backed out and they designed their own version of the tank called AMX-30. So Germany essentially reassessed its whole mindset towards armored warfare for the construction of this tank. And for those of you who are new to the concept of armored warfare, you have what's called the iron triangle. And the iron triangle is three functions of you have firepower, armored protection, and then mobility. And the aim of the game is to create the perfect balance of all three and hopefully get the superior tank on the battlefield. And typically when you move more in one direction of the triangle, you can lose aspects of the other components. So what Germany's new mindset was, after World War II, they reevaluated and they learned that their tanks from World War II were very heavy, very heavily armored and very upgunned, and their main function and focus was firepower and armor protection. But what they learned was no matter how much armor the tank has, there's always ordnance out there that is going to compromise the armor. So the mindset for the Leopard was, let's shift from advanced armor protection and achieve a more superior mobility. So 1955, we're in a place where anti-tank weapons are quite common, but we're not quite there with the high-tech guided missile technology. So the mindset was, if we achieve better mobility, agility and speed, it's going to be a lot harder for a tank to get hit. So advanced mobility then becomes the tank's primary form of protection, as opposed to heavier armor. And Germany definitely did achieve a high mobility tank with the Leopard. So the Leopard was developed and first saw service in 1965, and initially 15 countries actually purchased Leopard 1. However, almost immediately, early Leopard 1 turret, it was a cast dome-shaped turret. It was decided very quickly that they needed more ammunition and more armor protection on the turret, and they produced the next upgrade to Leopard 1 with a larger turret, which is like what you see here. The Leopard had the infamous L7 gun. So at that time, L7 was the new rifled 105mm. Most NATO countries used the L7 gun in all of their tanks. And at that time, it was cutting edge firepower. So the L7 is what we have here today. Quickly, ammunition, the tank will hold about 60 rounds of various different types of ammunition for the 105. What we have today is just your standard high explosive round, and this works best for our application of battlefield. We're not shooting heat or high velocity, we're just sending a slug into a hill. So we use the HE variant, which is what you see here. Today we are firing about a 22-pound projectile with roughly 7 pounds of powder, and we estimate that that's going to send the round down range at about 22 to 2400 feet per second. Touching on engines, the technology of the engine in this tank is pretty interesting. So again, World War II, Nazi armor, it had that reputation of high complexity, and that was very difficult to maintain and work on. Everybody knows Tiger I, it's a very famous tank. What a lot of people don't know, as an example of its complexity, to pull the transmission out of a Tiger, you have to lift off the turret to get the transmission out. Now that process is incredibly labor intensive and very complicated. So those lessons of reliability and simplicity to work on, now with the US influence for West Germany, a company called MTU developed the engine for this tank. And their goal was simplicity and reliability, and essentially MTU was one of the companies that foreran what is called the pack lift. So most modern tanks today, the pack is essentially everything you need to run the tank. So you have your engine, your transmission, your final drives, your cooling system is all essentially inside a frame, and it has a rapid unhook. So this tank in particular, after you pull off the lid, there's a few plugs that just quick disconnect, no tools required. You unhook the sprockets off the transmission through the center, and then you hook up to it, and a few other little steps, and the whole entire tank's power unit comes out together. You can then put the power pack down behind the tank and run an extension unit. So you have all the leads that the tank plugs into the engine, they just extend them with another kit, and the engine can be started and ran outside of the tank from the controls in the driver's compartment. This way they can run the engine from the outside and see leaks, services, and they can tell the driver how to control the engine. So the concept of ease and reliability has rapidly improved from where we were at during World War II with the German armor. It's said that a tank crew can lift a pack and swap in a new pack in about a 20-minute time frame. The engine, once again, it's an MTU 37 litre. It puts out about 830 horsepower. It's got about a 370 mile range on a fuel tank, and your top speed is about 40 miles an hour. So now I'm going to talk about the Leopard in particular to Australia's service. So this tank here is Leopard AS1. AS is the designated NATO designator for Australia. So around about the time, late 70s, Australia is looking to replace their main battle tank, the Centurion. The tank has had a lot of experience in the jungle in Vietnam. Australia decided that in order to replace the Centurion, they had a list of prerequisites that had to be met before they would even begin looking at a tank. And at that time, across the whole Western world, only Leopard 1 and the US M60 met Australia's prerequisites. So around 1971, it was approved that Australia would begin trialing for a new tank. They purchased 2 US M60A1s and 2 Leopard 1A5s. So for a year, Australia ran trials on both of these tanks and compared them very heavily to each other. And the final report is actually very interesting. So throughout the trials, each tank drove around 5,000 miles, 1,700 rounds of 105 was shot, a further 60,000 rounds of 7.62 coax, and 10,000 rounds of 50 cal machine gun was run for the trial. The big influencing reason as to why Australia did not purchase the US M60 at that time was M60 had a major flaw with its fighting compartment, in particular with the crew commander. So those of you not familiar with M60, on the roof of the turret, there's a secondary turret called a cupola, and the commander could use this cupola to find other targets. The problem with this setup was once the crew commander identified a target, he had to physically move out of his cupola down into the turret and lay the gun on and give the gunner directions for the next shot. The problem with him physically moving from one station to another was he would often lose sight of that target that he acquired. The M60 had some steering issues, so being as, like I talked about, the Germans' key focus with this was mobility, the steering and maneuverability is incredible. And when you put this tank in the jungle in a tight quarter, this performed very well. The M60 had some issues. The M60 had far superior armor protection to the Leopard, and both tanks scored very highly with ease of maintenance and ease of reliability. The issue with M60 was the US did not provide an option for us to purchase a recovery variant. So when a country purchases a new battle tank, they have to purchase supporting equipment. recovery vehicles a tank of the hull, which will have a crane that can lift engines and do maintenance on the tank fleet. The US did not offer that option as a purchase to Australia with the M60. However, Germany with the Leopard offered a variant of engineering tanks to support the Leopard fleet. However, the US offered a better guarantee with manufacturing and parts supply. So as a country, when you're purchasing new armor, you have to look at aspects other than the capabilities of the tank. So parts supply and a manufacturer guarantee of that tank was offered better through the US. However, it was negotiated with Germany that they could also provide a similar purchase. So Australia selected the Leopard tank, and they decided to add their own modifications. So being a hot weather climate, they had to change the cooling system. All the interior equipment had to be translated from German to English. And there were some other minor modifications Australia decided they wanted to do. And then in the end, they purchased a total of 103 of these Leopard AS1s. So the tank has a crew of 4. You have a driver up the front, and then 3 in the turret. You have a gunner. Immediately behind the gunner is the crew commander, and then on the other side of the turret is the loader. So some crew modifications, interestingly, for Australia. Australia decided they wanted to add more storage space on the back of the tank. So these baskets that you see here were actually modified by the crews. So a lot of the times a tank crew would go down to their maintenance shed with a case of beer and give some dimensions to the maintenance guys, and they'd have them weld up baskets. So each Australian tank had their own sort of way of designing the rear end. So that's a bit of personal touch, which was pretty cool, I thought. So I'll go through the markings real quickly, then the name. You'll see the big arrow on the side. That is the first thing that you look at when you're identifying the call sign of a tank. So the arrow dictates either the company or the squadron in the unit. So if the arrow is pointing in one direction, it'll be Alpha Company. It rotates, it becomes Bravo Company, Charlie Company, and pointing down Delta Company, and so on. Then the numbers you see on the side, 22 Alpha. The first number 2 is the 2nd squadron in the regiment. And then the next number 2 is the 2nd troop in that squadron. So you'll have 4 troops to a squadron. And then Alpha is the 1st tank in that squadron. So 22 would be your headquarters tank. And then you'll have Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, which are the 3 tanks in the troop. 22 Alpha in Australia, ever since Vietnam War, Australia has a tradition of naming its tanks, and that carries on that tradition. So always from Vietnam, 22 Alpha has always been known as Bourbon. And the other tanks in this troop were named after alcoholic beverages. The rule of thumb is, depending if you are Alpha Squadron, the name of your tank has to begin with an A. If you're Bravo Squadron, the name begins with a B, etc. So when you see, typically in NATO units, the name of a tank, first letter of that name is typically the company. You'll see the added camouflage. This is another modification that Australia did. It was like a strap-on netting, and behind the netting it had like a thermal IR protective barrier, and then the camouflage to help break up the outline and the surface of the tank. And then the added foliage was also to help break up the outline and camouflage. Australia's Leopards never fired a shot in anger. And eventually, around about the early 2000s, it was decided the Leopard was getting a little bit old, a little bit obsolete, and Australia looked to replace the Leopard. 2006, Australia purchased M1A1 Abrams off America, and the Leopards were then replaced. Most Leopards were never allowed to be sold outside of the Australian government, so most of them became displays at various clubs or gate guards in certain areas of the country. Now I'll hand over to Richie, and he'll talk about what it's like to drive the tank, how it feels, some of the controls. Here you go.
So yeah, you got to keep in mind that at our restoration shop, we often deal with Western tanks and like Eastern tanks. So like we have a lot of Russian equipment that we have our hands on. So I'm going to use the comparison between the two, because most people will only drive one style of tank, not the other. Russian equipment is very industrial. They designed it for pure functionality, not comfort. So some of the tanks that we have at Battlefield Vegas, I actually have scars on my arms just from driving the Russian tanks. Driving the tanks on the Russian is pretty hard, but here on the Leopard, they gave a little bit more thought for comfort, which does have its disadvantages. It's not all, you know, nice things. Here on the Leopard tank, you would be able to sip tea and drive the tank with one hand. It's very simplistic. It's got an automatic transmission. This can achieve true pivot, which means one track is moving forward and the other track is moving in the opposite direction, so you can turn this tank on a dime. Versus the Russian stuff, you're throwing levers around, and it's a workout just to move a Russian tank. But the caveat to that is if this breaks down, or there's problems with the type of steering, instead of having like a mechanical linkage that you're operating with your hand that you can run along and troubleshoot, you know, this has computers and fuses and electronic. There's probably a couple kilometers of wires inside of this tank. When it runs good, but if this tank goes down, it'll be a nightmare to try to troubleshoot all of the various electronic equipment that goes into making this a more comfortable tank an easier tank to operate and drive.
That's a freedom seat right there. That's a freedom seat.
One more thing, if you guys want to see the process of restoring these, we also do the live fire stuff as well. So if you want to see how privately, in private hands, we go about restoring these tanks to live fire conditions, including like engine swaps, stuff like that, check out our channel, Restoration Passion, and we'll go into a little bit more depth if you're interested in how these things are restored.